February 19, 1968, Firebase Charlie, Quang Tri Province, South Vietnam. 4:47 a.m. The first mortar round landed 30 meters from specialist Danny Martinez's foxhole, close enough to shower him with red earth and fragments of bamboo. The second round killed Private Johnson instantly. The third began what would become the longest 18 hours of Martinez's life, and for 47 other Americans at Firebase Charlie, the last 18 hours of any life at all. Martinez would later write to his mother in El Paso, "Ma, I always wondered what my worst day would look like. Now I know. It looks like hell opened up and forgot to close." But February 19th wasn't unique. It wasn't even particularly noteworthy in the grand scope of the Vietnam War. The Department of Defense casualty reports for that day list it simply as moderate enemy contact, resulting in 48 KIA, 63 WIA. Moderate. A word that would haunt Martinez for the next 55 years of his life. What makes a day the worst day? Is it the number of body bags filled? The screams that echo long after the mortars stop? Or is it the moment when a 19-year-old kid from Texas realizes that everything his drill sergeant told him about war was a lie? At Firebase Charlie, the worst day began with coffee that never got finished and letters home that never got sent. It began with Sergeant Williams shouting coordinates into a radio that had been shattered by shrapnel 10 minutes earlier. It began with Corpsman Rodriguez performing surgery with a bayonet because his medical kit was buried under 2 tons of collapsed sandbags. By 5:15 a.m., the Firebase's perimeter had been breached in 4 locations. By 6 a.m., half the bunkers were destroyed. By 7:30 a.m., Martinez was firing his M16 with one hand while holding his best friend's intestines in place with the other. The sun rose through smoke that morning, casting everything in a hellish orange glow. The jungle, which had been their protection, had become their prison. The helicopters, which were supposed to be their lifeline, couldn't land under the constant mortar fire. The war, which was supposed to be winnable, had become simply survivable. But here's what the official reports don't tell you. Martinez's worst day at Firebase. Charlie wasn't even close to being the worst day of the Vietnam War. Not even close to being the worst day of that month. Not even close to being the worst day that week. Because in Vietnam, the worst day wasn't an exception. It was just Tuesday. The morning briefings at Military Assistance Command Vietnam headquarters in Saigon painted a picture of methodical progress. Maps covered with blue and red pins suggested control. Statistics showed enemy body counts rising while American casualties remained, in military parlance, acceptable. The word routine appeared in situation reports with startling frequency throughout 1967 and early 1968. Routine patrol, routine reconnaissance, routine search and destroy mission. But 12,000 miles away from the Pentagon's polished corridors, routine had a different meaning entirely. On January 23, 1968, Company A of the 2nd Battalion, 502nd Infantry Regiment, conducted what their morning orders described as a routine patrol near the village of Phu Bai. 12 hours later, only 17 of the original 43 soldiers would walk back to base. The other 26 became statistics in a war where statistics had become meaningless. Captain Robert Hayes, the company commander, had briefed his men that morning with the same confidence that had been drilled into him at Fort Benning. Intelligence reports minimal enemy presence in the area, he told them, while they cleaned their weapons and checked their ammunition. We're looking at a standard sweep and clear operation, should be back by 1500 hours. The first sniper round hit Private Stevens in the head at 08:30 hours. The ambush that followed lasted 4 hours and 17 minutes. Transforming a routine patrol into what Hayes would later describe in his after-action report as the most intense combat experience of my military career. But Hayes's report was filed under routine operations because by January 1968, even the extraordinary had become ordinary. This was the first great deception of Vietnam, the normalization of catastrophe. What began as shocking exceptions, the brutal firefights, the devastating casualties, the complete breakdown of intelligence, gradually became the baseline of American military experience. A day with only 2 killed in action was considered quiet. A week with fewer than 50 casualties was considered successful. A month with fewer than 200 dead Americans was considered a strategic victory. Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, who served as intelligence officer for the 1st Infantry Division, would later reflect, "We kept waiting for the bad days to end and the normal days to return. It took us 2 years to realize the bad days were the normal days." The psychological transformation was insidious. Soldiers who had arrived in country expecting clearly defined battles instead found themselves in a war where the enemy was invisible, the objectives were unclear, and survival itself had become the primary mission. Letters home from the first half of 1967 speak of homesickness and boredom. Letters from the second half speak of death and madness. Corporal Michael Chen, writing to his girlfriend in San Francisco in March 1968, captured this shift. "You asked me what a typical day looks like over here. Honey, there are no typical days. There are only days when everyone dies and days when most people die. Yesterday was a good day. We only lost 3 guys." The military command structure designed for conventional warfare struggled to adapt to this new reality. Traditional metrics of success, territory gained, enemy positions destroyed, strategic objectives achieved, became irrelevant in a conflict where the enemy melted away after each engagement and the territory changed hands weekly. Instead, success was measured in negative terms. How many soldiers didn't die? How many patrols didn't encounter heavy resistance? How many villages didn't need to be evacuated? This semantic shift had profound implications. When losing fewer soldiers than expected becomes a victory, when returning alive from a patrol becomes an achievement, when surviving until morning becomes a strategic goal, the very definition of warfare changes. The worst day in traditional military thinking was an aberration, a day when everything went wrong, when plans failed, when casualties mounted beyond acceptable levels. In Vietnam, the worst day became the standard by which all other days were measured. Veterans would return from patrols not asking, "How did it go?" but rather, "How bad was it?" The question wasn't whether casualties would occur, but how many. The question wasn't whether the mission would succeed, but whether anyone would survive to report its failure. By the time the Tet Offensive began on January 31, 1968, American forces had already been conditioned to expect the worst. What they weren't prepared for was discovering that their worst expectations had been woefully inadequate. The routine had prepared them for hell. But hell, as it turned out, had multiple levels. The mathematics of catastrophe tell a story that official rhetoric never could. Between January 1 and December 31, 1968, there were 47 separate days when American casualties in Vietnam exceeded 100 killed or wounded. 47 days when the combined total of dead and injured Americans surpassed the number of people killed in the September 11th attacks. January 31, 1968, the first day of the Tet Offensive, produced 246 American casualties. February 24th, 189 casualties. May 5th, during the Battle of Hamburger Hill, 298 casualties. These weren't aberrations, they were Tuesdays. To put this in perspective, the worst single day of casualties during the Iraq War resulted in 37 American deaths. The worst day in Afghanistan, 38 deaths. In Vietnam, there were 12 individual days in 1968 alone when American deaths exceeded 100. The worst single day, May 11, 1968, saw 181 Americans killed in action across multiple engagements, more than the total American deaths in Iraq and Afghanistan during many entire months of those conflicts. But raw casualty figures only begin to tell the story. The Pentagon's own classified reports, declassified in 1993, reveal the staggering scope of what constituted a routine day in Vietnam. On average, during the peak years of 1967-1969, American forces in Vietnam experienced 47 separate combat engagements per day, 23 casualties per day, killed and wounded combined, 156 rounds of incoming mortar or rocket fire per day, 89 medical evacuations per day. These numbers represent human lives, not statistics. Each medical evacuation was someone's son writing his last letter home. Each combat engagement was 40 to 50 young Americans fighting for their lives in a jungle that wanted to kill them. Each casualty was a telegram that would destroy a family back home. The concentration of catastrophe was equally revealing. The 25th Infantry Division, operating in the Cu Chi district, averaged one major engagement every 2.3 days during 1968. The 1st Cavalry Division, Airmobile, conducted 1,682 combat assaults in 1968, an average of 4.6 combat landings under fire every single day of the year. The Marines at Khe Sanh endured 1,307 separate rocket and mortar attacks during the 77-day siege, an average of 17 attacks per day. Perhaps most telling was the evolution of medical statistics. In 1965, the ratio of wounded to killed American personnel in Vietnam was 2.6 to 1, roughly consistent with World War II and Korea. By 1968, that ratio had increased to 7.4 to 1. This wasn't because the enemy had become less lethal. It was because American medical evacuation and field surgery had become extraordinarily efficient at keeping soldiers alive who would have died in previous wars. Dr. Edward Hirsch, chief surgeon at the 3rd Surgical Hospital in Bien Hoa, kept meticulous records of his operating room. In April 1968, during the second wave of the Tet Offensive, his surgical team performed 847 operations in 30 days. That's 28.2 surgeries every day, many lasting 6 to 8 hours each. Hirsch's diary entry from April 23rd reads, "We operated for 19 straight hours today, saved 23 kids who would have died in any previous war. I'm not sure whether that makes me proud or horrified." The helicopter medevac statistics provide another window into the daily reality of Vietnam. During 1968, American dust-off helicopters completed 203,000 medical evacuations, an average of 556 wounded soldiers pulled from combat zones every single day. The pilots of the 57th Medical Detachment flew an average of 6.8 missions per day, landing in hot landing zones under enemy fire to extract casualties. Chief Warrant Officer Michael Durant, who flew medevac missions throughout 1968, logged 394 combat missions that year. His aircraft was hit by enemy fire 127 times. He was shot down twice, wounded once, and decorated for valor 4 times. In his final report, Durant wrote, "In a normal war, any one of those missions would have been the experience of a lifetime. Here, they were just Tuesday through Sunday." The ammunition consumption figures reveal the intensity of daily combat. American forces in Vietnam expended an average of 1.3 million rounds of small arms ammunition per day during 1968. Artillery units fired an average of 4,200 rounds daily. The Air Force dropped 3,500 tons of ordnance every day, roughly equivalent to the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima every 3 weeks. These numbers don't capture the psychological toll, but they provide context for understanding what constituted normalcy in Vietnam. When your baseline is 556 wounded soldiers evacuated daily, when normal means 23 casualties per day, when routine includes 47 combat engagements in 24 hours, the definition of worst day requires recalibration. The worst day wasn't an exception to the rule. The worst day was the rule. "Dear Mom and Dad, I don't know how to write this letter. I've started it 17 times, and every time I get to the part where I'm supposed to tell you I'm okay, I stop writing because I'm not sure that's true anymore." Private First Class Michael O'Brien, 19 years old, from Burlington, Vermont, wrote these words on February 15, 1968, 4 days after what he would later describe as the day I stopped believing in God, America, and myself, all in the span of about 6 hours. O'Brien's letter, preserved in the National Archives along with 47,000 other pieces of correspondence from Vietnam veterans, provides an unfiltered window into what the worst day actually felt like from ground level. Unlike the sanitized after-action reports or the optimistic press briefings, O'Brien's words carry the weight of lived experience. February 11th started like any other day, he continued. Kowalski was heating up sea rations and complaining about the rain. Martinez was showing everyone pictures of his new baby girl for the 100th time. Johnson was writing another letter to that girl in Phoenix who probably forgot about him months ago. We were supposed to sweep a village about 6 clicks north of our position. Intelligence said it was clear. Intelligence was wrong. The village was Phuoc Bin, a cluster of 23 hooches nestled in a bend of the Songbi River. Population, approximately 150 civilians, mostly elderly and children. American intelligence had classified it as pacified, based on reports that the local Viet Cong infrastructure had been eliminated during Operation Junction City the previous year. The first thing that should have told us something was wrong was the silence, O'Brien wrote. No kids running around, no chickens, no dogs barking, just this heavy, dead quiet that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. Sergeant Williams said it felt like a graveyard. He was more right than he knew. What followed was a textbook L-shaped ambush executed by an estimated company-strength NVA unit that had been using the village as a base of operations for 3 weeks. The attack began at 10:47 hours when O'Brien's squad was approximately 50 meters from the first hooch. The first shot took Rodriguez's head clean off, just gone. 1 second he was there checking his compass, the next second there was just blood and helmet flying through the air. Then everything happened at once. Machine gun fire from 3 directions, mortars landing all around us, and this high-pitched screaming that took me a minute to realize was coming from me. O'Brien's squad of 12 soldiers was caught in the open with no cover, except a small drainage ditch that barely provided protection from direct fire. The nearest artillery support was 18 minutes away. The closest helicopter landing zone was 2 kilometers through enemy-controlled territory. Kowalski caught one in the stomach and kept screaming for his mother, not just yelling, really screaming like a little kid who's lost in a department store. Williams was trying to call for air support, but the radio was shot to pieces. Martinez was lying face down in the mud, and I couldn't tell if he was dead or just playing dead. I was shooting at everything and nothing because I couldn't see where the fire was coming from. The engagement lasted 3 hours and 47 minutes. When it ended, 7 of the 12 Americans were dead, 3 were wounded so severely they would never return to combat, and 2, O'Brien and Private Jackson from Detroit, were physically unharmed but psychologically shattered. The thing that got to me wasn't the dying, O'Brien continued. I mean, it was horrible, don't get me wrong. But what really messed me up was finding out that the village chief, this old man who had been helping our intelligence guys for months, was the one who set us up. They found him after the firefight with an AK-47 and a chest full of medals from the North Vietnamese army. The guy we thought was our friend had been planning to kill us for weeks. The betrayal was complete and systematic. The village chief had provided detailed intelligence about American patrol patterns, weapon capabilities, and radio frequencies. The attack had been planned specifically for O'Brien's unit, timed to coincide with a period when air support would be delayed due to weather conditions. How do you fight an enemy who looks like everyone else? How do you trust anyone when the people you're supposed to be protecting are the ones trying to kill you? How do you explain to your parents back home that their son is fighting in a war where nothing makes sense and nobody knows why we're here? O'Brien never sent the letter. It was found in his personal effects after he was killed in action on March 23, 1968, during what his commanding officer described as a routine patrol in a secured area. His parents received 2 letters that week, one from the Department of Defense informing them of their son's death, and one from Michael himself, written 6 weeks earlier, telling them he was fine and would be home soon. While Private O'Brien was fighting for his life in Phuoc Bin, Corporal Sandra Mitchell was watching Marines die at the Khe Sanh combat base, 340 kilometers to the north. At the same moment, Rodriguez was calling for his mother in a drainage ditch. Hospital corpsman James Park was performing emergency surgery in a bunker, while 122mm rockets exploded overhead. When O'Brien's radio went silent, Major William Hayes was coordinating the defense of Hue City as North Vietnamese regulars fought American forces room by room through Vietnam's ancient imperial capital. February 11, 1968, wasn't just O'Brien's worst day. It was South Vietnam's worst day all at the same time. The scope of coordinated catastrophe during the Tet Offensive revealed something unprecedented in American military history: the possibility of an entire theater of operations having its worst day simultaneously. From the DMZ to the Mekong Delta, from the mountains of the Central Highlands to the streets of Saigon, American forces faced their most intense combat across a front that spanned 650 kilometers and included 36 major population centers. At Khe Sanh, 6,000 Marines endured the 77th consecutive day of siege conditions that made O'Brien's 6-hour firefight seem brief by comparison. The base received an average of 1,300 incoming rounds per day, one explosion every 66 seconds, 24 hours a day for 11 weeks straight. Corporal Mitchell, one of only 17 female Marines in the combat zone, kept a diary that documented the psychological progression from fear to numbness to something beyond both. Day 77. Can't remember what silence sounds like, she wrote. Johnson cracked yesterday, started laughing during a rocket attack and couldn't stop. They medevaced him out this morning, still laughing. I think I understand why. When everything is insane, sanity becomes the crazy thing. The numbers tell the story of synchronized destruction. On February 11th alone, Khe Sanh, 89. American casualties from rocket and mortar attacks, Hue City, 147 American casualties during urban combat, Saigon, 67 American casualties defending the U.S. Embassy and Tan Son Nhut Air Base, Mekong Delta, 203 American casualties across 14 separate engagements, Y Corps, 89 additional casualties from attacks on fire bases and supply lines. Total American casualties for that single day, 595 killed and wounded across the length of South Vietnam. More American casualties in 24 hours than the entire Iraq War experienced in some months. But the geographic distribution of catastrophe revealed something more disturbing than the raw numbers. The complete breakdown of the concept of rear areas, or secure zones. Traditional military doctrine assumes that combat occurs at the front lines, while support operations happen in relative safety behind them. Vietnam demolished this assumption entirely. Major Sarah Chen, an intelligence analyst stationed at the secure Long Binh logistics base, discovered this reality at 300 hours on February 11th, when 107mm rockets began landing on her barracks. We were supposed to be 20 kilometers behind the front lines, she later wrote. Nobody told the North Vietnamese that. Nobody told the rockets that either. The attacks on Saigon were particularly psychologically devastating because they struck at the symbolic heart of the American presence in Vietnam. The U.S. Embassy, considered the most secure American facility in Southeast Asia, was overrun by 19 Viet Cong sappers who held the compound for 6 hours and 17 minutes. Television cameras captured images of American Marines fighting for their lives in the embassy courtyard, the same courtyard where optimistic press conferences had been held just weeks earlier. Ambassador Ellsworth Bunker, evacuated from his residence at 0400 hours, summed up the strategic implications. If they can attack the embassy, they can attack anywhere. If they can attack anywhere, then nowhere is safe. If nowhere is safe, then what the hell are we doing here? The simultaneity of attacks across such a vast geographic area required coordination that American intelligence had deemed impossible. The idea that North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces could synchronize major attacks from the DMZ to Cambodia, from the mountains to the coast, challenged fundamental assumptions about enemy capabilities. Colonel David Williams, operations officer for Military Assistance Command Vietnam, later admitted, "We had convinced ourselves that they were a bunch of guys in black pajamas hiding in the jungle. Turns out they had better communications and coordination than we did. They hit us everywhere at once because they planned to hit us everywhere at once. We just never believed they could." The geographic expansion of catastrophe meant that American families couldn't comfort themselves with the thought that their sons were in relatively safe areas. Every place was the front line. Every day was potentially the worst day. Every letter home carried the possibility of being the last letter home. The war had become omnipresent, and omnipresence had made catastrophe routine. January 31st, 1968. 0300 hours. Tet Nguyen Dan, the Vietnamese New Year. While American intelligence analysts slept peacefully in Saigon, confident that the traditional Tet ceasefire would hold as it had in previous years, 84,000 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters were moving into final positions across South Vietnam. In exactly 3 hours, they would launch the largest coordinated attack in the history of the Vietnam War, transforming not just the military situation but the very definition of what constituted America's worst day. The attack began with a 107mm rocket screaming into Tan Son Nhut Air Base at 600 hours, followed simultaneously by assaults on the Independence Palace, the National Radio Station, the Joint General Staff Compound, and the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. Within 30 minutes, Communist forces had attacked 5 of the 6 largest cities in South Vietnam, 13 provincial capitals, and more than 100 smaller towns and military installations. But Tet wasn't just an escalation, it was a revelation. For 3 years, American commanders had been fighting what they believed was a guerrilla war against an elusive enemy who struck in small units and melted away into the jungle. Tet proved they had been fighting a conventional war against a conventional army that had simply been waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Master Sergeant Robert Hayes was on duty at the U.S. Embassy when the first satchel charges exploded at the main gate. His after-action report captures the immediate shock. At 02:47 hours, 19 individuals in civilian clothing approached the embassy perimeter. I assumed they were late-night revelers celebrating Tet. At 02:48 hours, they produced automatic weapons and rocket-propelled grenades. At 02:49 hours, I realized everything we had been told about this war was wrong. The embassy attack lasting 6 hours and 17 minutes became the defining image of Tet. Not because it was militarily significant, but because it shattered the illusion of American control. The compound that symbolized American power in Southeast Asia had been overrun by 19 men with rifles. The most secure building in Saigon had become a battlefield. Television cameras captured images that would define the war. American Marines firing from behind concrete planters, embassy windows shattered by gunfire, bodies lying in the manicured courtyard where diplomats had hosted garden parties just days earlier. Walter Cronkite would later call it the night America lost the Vietnam War. But the embassy was just one small part of a catastrophe that encompassed the entire country. In Hue, North Vietnamese regulars raised their flag over the Imperial Palace and held the ancient capital for 25 days. In Can Tho, Viet Cong forces captured the radio station and broadcast surrender demands in perfect English. In Bien Hoa, sappers destroyed 27 American aircraft on the ground in a single coordinated attack. The scale of coordination revealed capabilities that American intelligence had consistently underestimated. Communist forces didn't just attack randomly, they attacked strategically, targeting communication centers, airfields, ammunition dumps, and command structures with precision that suggested detailed intelligence and months of preparation. General William Westmoreland, commanding American forces in Vietnam, had confidently predicted just weeks earlier that enemy forces were unable to mount a major offensive operation. His intelligence chief, General Philip Davidson, had assured Washington that North Vietnamese forces lacked the capability for large-scale coordinated attacks. They were spectacularly, catastrophically wrong. The first day of Tet produced 1,136 American casualties, killed, wounded, and missing. The first week produced 4,324 American casualties. The first month produced 14,592 American casualties. Numbers that transformed the statistical definition of America's worst day from a single catastrophic event to a sustained catastrophic condition. Captain Michael Durant, a helicopter pilot conducting medical evacuations during Tet, flew 37 missions in the first 4 days of the offensive, more than most pilots flew in an entire tour. His aircraft was shot down twice, hit by enemy fire 14 times, and landed in 12 separate landing zones while under direct fire. His flight log for February 1st reads, 0600 to 2300 hours, continuous combat operations, lost count of missions after number 12, lost count of wounded after number 89, aircraft total loss, crew survived. But perhaps most revealing was the reaction of South Vietnamese forces during Tet. Units that American advisors had trained and equipped for 3 years simply disappeared when the attacks began. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN, experienced desertion rates exceeding 50% during the first week of Tet, as soldiers abandoned their posts to protect their families. Colonel James Park, advisor to the ARVN 18th Division, reported, "At 0800 hours on January 31st, I had 3,200 Vietnamese soldiers under my command. By 1200 hours, I had 1,400. By 1800 hours, I had 800. These weren't combat losses. These were men who simply went home. They decided that protecting their families was more important than protecting their country. I can't say I blame them." Tet had revealed not just enemy strength, but ally weakness, not just American vulnerability, but South Vietnamese fragility. The worst day had become the worst month, and the worst month was becoming the worst year. By May 1969, the concept of a worst day had undergone such complete transformation that American soldiers had stopped using the term entirely. Instead, they spoke in comparative degrees of catastrophe: bad day, really bad day, and Tuesday. The Battle of Hamburger Hill, which began on May 10th and continued for 10 days, represented the final evolution of this semantic shift. From exceptional disaster to routine annihilation, Hill 937, known to topographical maps as Ap Bia Mountain, stood 937 meters above sea level near the Laotian border in the A Shau Valley. To American planners, it was objective: Hill 937. To the soldiers who would fight there, it became Hamburger Hill, because that's what happened to human bodies when they met concentrated machine gun fire, artillery, and mortars on a jungle-covered slope with no cover and no concealment. The numbers from Hamburger Hill tell the story of escalation reaching its logical conclusion. The 101st Airborne Division's 3rd Brigade launched the initial assault with 1,800 soldiers. 10 days later, 72 Americans were dead, 372 were wounded, and the hill was abandoned immediately after being captured. American forces had suffered 444 casualties to take terrain that was considered militarily worthless and strategically irrelevant. Sergeant Anthony Barbato, who survived 7 assaults on the hill's summit, kept a detailed journal during the battle. His entry for May 15th captures the psychological transformation. "Today was a good day. We only lost 12 guys instead of 23. Johnson says that means we're winning. I asked him what we're winning, and he couldn't answer. Neither can I." But Hamburger Hill was just the most visible example of a broader pattern that had emerged by 1969. American forces were being ordered to assault heavily fortified enemy positions for no clear strategic purpose, suffer enormous casualties, and then abandon the territory immediately afterward. The military called it search and destroy. The soldiers called it search and die. The media called it senseless. They were all correct. The A Shau Valley, where Hamburger Hill was located, had been the site of 17 major battles between 1966 and 1969. American forces had cleared the valley multiple times, each operation resulting in hundreds of casualties, only to have North Vietnamese forces reoccupy it within weeks. Each battle was bloodier than the last because each battle was fought against better prepared enemy positions with more sophisticated weapons and deeper bunker complexes. Lieutenant Colonel Weldon Honeycutt, commanding the 3rd Battalion, 187th Infantry Regiment during Hamburger Hill, exemplified the military mindset that had emerged by 1969. When asked by reporters why the hill needed to be taken, he responded, "We're taking this hill because it's there and because the enemy is on it. That's reason enough." When asked what would happen after it was taken, he said, "That's not my job to decide. My job is to take it." This compartmentalization of responsibility had become endemic throughout American forces in Vietnam. Soldiers fought battles they didn't understand, for objectives they couldn't explain, as part of a strategy that no one seemed able to articulate. The worst day had become not just routine, but purposeless. The escalation to purposeless catastrophe was measurable. During 1967, American forces averaged 2.3 major engagements per week, resulting in 50 or more casualties. During 1968, that number increased to 4.1 engagements per week. During the first half of 1969, it reached 6.8 engagements per week. Each engagement was deadlier than previous ones because enemy forces were becoming more sophisticated while American objectives remained unclear. Captain David Miller, a company commander in the 25th Infantry Division, documented this escalation in letters to his father. In 1967, a bad day meant we ran into a squad of guerrillas and had a firefight. In 1968, a bad day meant we ran into a company of regulars and called in airstrikes. In 1969, a bad day means we assault a mountain full of bunkers because somebody in Saigon looked at a map and decided we should. I don't know what 1970 will bring, but I don't want to find out. The psychological impact of purposeless escalation was devastating. Soldiers could accept dying for victory, or dying for their brothers, or dying to protect innocent people. They could not accept dying for no reason at all. The worst day had evolved from a day when everything went wrong to a day when nothing made sense. By mid-1969, American units were experiencing what military psychiatrists termed combat fatigue, at rates unprecedented in American military history. Not battle fatigue from exposure to combat, but fatigue from exposure to combat that served no discernible purpose. Men were breaking down not from fear of death, but from the meaninglessness of death. The final escalation had been achieved. The worst day was no longer the day when the most soldiers died. The worst day was every day because every day was equally senseless. By late 1969, something fundamental had broken inside the American military machine in Vietnam. Not the weapons or the logistics or the communications, but the psychological framework that makes warfare psychologically survivable. When the concept of worst day loses all meaning, because every day is indistinguishable from catastrophe, soldiers stop processing reality through traditional categories of experience. Dr. Jonathan Boris, a military psychiatrist stationed at the 3rd Surgical Hospital in Bien Hoa, documented this transformation in a classified report that wouldn't be declassified until 1994. His findings were stark. American soldiers in Vietnam are experiencing a form of psychological adaptation I have never seen in military literature. They are not becoming hardened to combat. They are becoming disconnected from it entirely. They fight, they kill, they watch friends die, and they feel nothing. This is not courage. This is dissociation. The symptoms were pervasive and unprecedented. Soldiers would perform acts of extraordinary heroism, running through machine gun fire to rescue wounded comrades, calling in artillery strikes on their own positions to stop enemy advances, and then show no emotional response whatsoever. They would receive Bronze Stars and Purple Hearts with the same blank expression they wore when eating sea rations or cleaning their weapons. Specialist Robert Chen, who served with the 9th Infantry Division from 1968 to 1969, captured this psychological state in a letter to his brother. "You asked me what it's like over here. I don't know how to answer that because I don't know what like means anymore. Yesterday I shot a kid who couldn't have been more than 14. The day before that, Martinez stepped on a mine, and I had to put his legs in a body bag while the rest of him was still talking. This morning I ate scrambled eggs and read a comic book. I felt the same about all three things. Nothing. This wasn't the traditional shell shock or combat fatigue that had been documented in previous wars. Those conditions involved overreaction to trauma, nightmares, anxiety attacks, uncontrollable shaking. What American forces were experiencing in Vietnam was underreaction to trauma, complete emotional numbness in situations that should have produced intense psychological responses. The military called it combat effectiveness. The soldiers called it going robot. The psychiatrists called it psychic numbing. All three terms describe the same phenomenon: young American men learning to function in an environment where human emotion had become a liability. Captain Michael Rodriguez, a company commander in the 101st Airborne, described the progression. "When I first got here, losing a soldier was traumatic. The whole company would be affected for days. By my 6th month, losing a soldier was unfortunate. We'd have a brief ceremony and move on. By my 10th month, losing a soldier was Tuesday. We'd bag the body, call in the medevac, and start the paperwork. No emotion, no ceremony, no reaction at all. Just procedure." The psychological adaptation was measurable. Military psychiatrists tracking stress indicators found that soldiers who had been in country for less than 3 months showed elevated cortisol levels, disrupted sleep patterns, and other physiological markers of acute stress. Soldiers who had been in country for more than 8 months showed cortisol levels below normal ranges, eerily regular sleep patterns even during combat, and what Dr. Boris termed affective flattening, the complete absence of emotional response to traumatic stimuli. The transformation wasn't limited to combat situations. Soldiers stopped reacting emotionally to mail from home, to news of deaths in other units, to their own injuries. Corpsman James Park documented treating a soldier who had been shot through the shoulder and was calmly reading a magazine while Park cleaned the wound. "I asked him if it hurt," Park wrote. "He looked at me like it was the stupidest question he'd ever heard and said, 'Everything hurts. What's your point?'" Perhaps most disturbing was the complete breakdown of the traditional bonding mechanisms that held military units together. Soldiers stopped forming close friendships because close friends inevitably died or were wounded severely enough to be evacuated. They stopped learning the names of replacements because replacements had life expectancies measured in weeks. They stopped writing letters home because they had nothing left to say that wouldn't terrify their families. Lieutenant Sarah Morrison, one of the few female officers serving in combat zones, observed this phenomenon from a unique perspective. "The men I commanded in 1969 were physically identical to the men I had commanded in 1967, but psychologically, they were completely different creatures. The 1967 soldiers would joke, complain, form friendships, get excited about mail call, cry when friends died. The 1969 soldiers did their jobs, followed orders, and felt nothing. They were more efficient killing machines, but they were no longer recognizably human. The psychological transformation had strategic implications that military planners hadn't anticipated. Units composed of emotionally disconnected soldiers were more effective in combat. They took fewer unnecessary risks, made more rational tactical decisions, and maintained better fire discipline under pressure. But they were also completely unreliable for any mission requiring initiative, creativity, or moral judgment. Colonel David Hayes, intelligence officer for the 2 Field Force Vietnam, documented this problem in a confidential report. "Our soldiers will execute any direct order without hesitation, including orders that are tactically unsound or morally questionable. They have lost the capacity for independent moral reasoning that prevents military units from becoming death squads. We have created the perfect soldiers for a war that shouldn't be fought, and they are incapable of stopping themselves from fighting it." The psychological numbing also affected soldiers' perception of time. Traditional combat stress involves hypervigilance and heightened awareness of immediate threats. Vietnam soldiers experienced the opposite, a kind of temporal dissociation where hours, days, and weeks blended into an undifferentiated blur of routine violence. Sergeant Michael O'Sullivan, who served 2 tours in Vietnam, described this phenomenon. "People back home would ask me about specific battles or specific days, and I couldn't answer them because I honestly couldn't remember. Not because the memories were too painful, but because nothing stood out anymore. Every day was the same day. Every firefight was the same firefight. Every casualty was the same casualty. Time stopped meaning anything." By 1970, the psychological transformation was complete. American soldiers in Vietnam had adapted so thoroughly to catastrophic conditions that they had lost the capacity to recognize catastrophe. The worst day had become so normalized that it was no longer psychologically distinguishable from any other day. They had survived the unsurvivable by becoming something other than survivors. 55 years later, Daniel Martinez sits in his living room in El Paso, Texas, staring at a photograph from February 1968. The image shows a group of 19-year-old soldiers at Firebase Charlie, grinning at the camera with the casual confidence of young men who believed they were invincible. Martinez is the only one still alive. "People ask me about my worst day in Vietnam," Martinez says, his voice carrying the weight of decades. "I tell them there was no worst day because there was no best day. There was just that year when I was 19 and I learned that hell is real and it's not a place you go when you die. It's a place you go when you're still alive, and some part of you never leaves." The statistical legacy of Vietnam's worst days is now preserved in government databases and medical journals. The Department of Veterans Affairs has treated 3.4 million Vietnam veterans for service-related conditions, since 1975. Of these, 1.7 million have been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. The average age of diagnosis, 58 years old, nearly 3 decades after their service ended. Dr. Sarah Chen, now director of the National Center for PTSD, explains the delayed manifestation. Vietnam veterans didn't develop PTSD decades after the war. They had PTSD during the war, but they were too busy surviving to process it. The emotional numbing that kept them alive in combat became a prison that trapped them for the rest of their lives. The numbers tell a story of delayed catastrophe. Vietnam veterans have suicide rates 1.7 times higher than non-veterans of the same age group. They have divorce rates 2.3 times higher. They have rates of homelessness, substance abuse, and chronic unemployment that dwarf those of veterans from other conflicts. The worst day, it turns out, lasted 50 years. Michael O'Sullivan, the sergeant who couldn't distinguish one day from another in Vietnam, spent 37 years unable to sleep more than 3 hours at a time. "I kept waiting for the mortar attack," he explains. "Every night for 37 years, I would lie in bed waiting for the mortars to start falling. They never did, but my body never got the message." The psychological aftermath took forms that surprised even experienced military psychiatrists. Many veterans reported not nightmares about combat, but dreams about normalcy. Dreams where they were back home with their families, only to wake up in Vietnam again. Even decades later, some veterans report waking up surprised to find themselves in their own bedrooms instead of a jungle bunker. Robert Hayes, the company commander who led the routine patrol that became a massacre, returned home in 1969 to a hero's welcome and a Bronze Star. He spent the next 15 years as a successful insurance salesman, married his high school sweetheart, raised 3 children, and never spoke about Vietnam to anyone. In 1984, he killed himself in his garage with his service pistol. His suicide note consisted of a single sentence: "I never should have come home." The geographical displacement was as traumatic as the temporal displacement. Veterans reported feeling more comfortable in Asian cities than in American suburbs, more at ease in chaotic environments than in peaceful ones. James Park, the corpsman who performed surgery with a bayonet, became a successful emergency room physician but could never adapt to routine family life. "I could handle 12 trauma cases in an ER shift without breaking a sweat," Park explains. "But sitting at my daughter's piano recital, I would have panic attacks. The quiet was unbearable. I needed the chaos to feel normal." The intergenerational transmission of trauma became apparent by the 1990s. Children of Vietnam veterans showed elevated rates of anxiety disorders, depression, and behavioral problems compared to children of non-veterans. The worst day, it seemed, was hereditary. Dr. Michael Durant, the helicopter pilot who flew 394 combat missions, never flew again after Vietnam. "People assume I was afraid of flying," he says. "That wasn't it. I was afraid of not being needed. In Vietnam, every mission mattered because someone was dying and needed help. Back home, flying was just transportation. I couldn't handle being irrelevant." The reconciliation process took decades and remains incomplete. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial, dedicated in 1982, provided some measure of acknowledgement, but many veterans found the black granite wall more disturbing than comforting. "It's a list of everyone who didn't make it home," explains Martinez. But what about those of us who made it home but never really left? Perhaps most telling is the evolution of how veterans describe their service. In the 1970s, they rarely spoke about it at all. In the 1980s, they spoke about it in terms of individual heroism or sacrifice. By the 2000s, they spoke about it as a collective trauma that had marked an entire generation. "We were 19-year-old kids who got dropped into an impossible situation," Martinez reflects. "We did things we never thought we were capable of, saw things we never thought we could survive seeing, and lost friends we never thought we could live without. Then we came home and pretended it never happened for 40 years. The worst day, for Vietnam veterans, wasn't a single day in Southeast Asia. It was every day since, spent trying to reconcile who they were before Vietnam with who they became after. It was a war of mud and monsoons, where young Americans learned that courage and cowardice looked exactly the same when filtered through 18 hours of continuous combat. It was a war of mathematics, where success was measured not by territory gained or objectives achieved, but by the daily arithmetic of survival. How many came back? How many didn't? How many wished they hadn't? It was a war that transformed the very definition of America's worst day, from an aberration to be endured into a baseline to be expected. The story of Vietnam's worst days is ultimately the story of a generation's forced evolution. 19-year-old farm boys from Iowa and factory workers from Detroit who arrived in Southeast Asia believing in clear objectives and decisive victories, only to discover that modern warfare had no objectives and produced no victories, only endless variations of catastrophe measured in degrees of intensity. Daniel Martinez, now 74, still flinches when he hears helicopter rotors. Michael O'Sullivan, 67, still can't sleep through the night without medication. Sarah Morrison, 71, still feels guilty about coming home when so many others didn't. They are living reminders that the worst day doesn't end when the shooting stops. It echoes through decades, transmitted from fathers to sons, from nightmares to waking hours, from memory to DNA. But their stories also reveal something profound about human resilience and adaptation. These men and women didn't just survive the unsurvivable. They found ways to build meaningful lives despite carrying the weight of experiences that should have destroyed them. They became teachers, doctors, mechanics, and parents. They raised families, built communities, and found ways to transform their trauma into wisdom. The mathematical legacy of Vietnam's worst days is now preserved in government archives. 58,281 American deaths, 304,000 wounded, 2,583 missing in action. But behind every statistic is a story like Martinez's firefight at Firebase Charlie, like O'Brien's betrayal at Phuoc Bin, like the Marines' siege at Khe Sanh. Behind every number is a moment when someone's worst day became everyone's worst day, when individual catastrophe became collective trauma, when American exceptionalism met Asian reality and discovered its limits. The broader implications extend far beyond Vietnam itself. The transformation of worst day from exception to routine presaged America's experience in Iraq, Afghanistan, and every subsequent conflict where victory proved elusive and objectives remained unclear. The psychological numbing that allowed soldiers to function in impossible situations became a template for how Americans would process future military engagements where success could not be defined and failure could not be acknowledged. Vietnam's worst days also revealed the limitations of technology, firepower, and resources when confronted with an enemy that refused to fight according to American expectations. The same military machine that had defeated Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan in 4 years spent 11 years in Vietnam trying to defeat an enemy that wouldn't stand still long enough to be decisively defeated. The worst day became routine precisely because American military doctrine had no framework for conflicts that couldn't be won through superior firepower and unlimited resources. Perhaps most significantly, Vietnam's worst days marked the end of American military innocence. The belief that American soldiers fight only just wars for clearly defined objectives with overwhelming popular support. Every subsequent military engagement has been filtered through the Vietnam experience, measured against the standard of worst days becoming routine days, evaluated according to the precedent of young Americans dying for objectives they couldn't understand in service of strategies their commanders couldn't explain. The veterans who survived Vietnam's worst days carry with them not just personal trauma, but historical knowledge about the limits of American power and the cost of American hubris. They understand viscerally what policymakers learned intellectually, that military force has boundaries, that good intentions don't guarantee good outcomes, and that the worst day isn't always the day when everything goes wrong. Sometimes it's the day when you realize that nothing was ever right to begin with. Their sacrifice deserves more than remembrance. It demands understanding. Understanding that the worst day in Vietnam wasn't exceptional but representative, not aberrational but systematic, not accidental but inevitable, given the contradictions between American expectations and Vietnamese realities. It was a war of fire that burned away illusions about American invincibility. It was a war of doubt that questioned assumptions about American righteousness. It was a war that changed America forever by revealing that even the most powerful nation in history could find itself trapped in conflicts where power meant nothing and victory meant less. The stories of Vietnam's worst days continue to resonate because they remind us that behind every foreign policy decision, every military intervention, every commitment of American forces overseas, are 19-year-old kids who will bear the consequences of those decisions for the rest of their lives. They deserve leaders who understand that the worst day isn't just a statistical probability, it's a human certainty. Subscribe for more untold stories from Vietnam and share in the comments what this war means to you or your family. Because the worst day doesn't end when the last helicopter lifts off. It continues in the memories of those who lived it and the lessons of those who must learn from it.